And start. Do what thou wilt shall be the whole of the law. Welcome, everybody, to Esoteric Antecedents of Thelema. We're going to be talking about Plotinus, who's one of the great Roman philosophers of the later Roman Empire, and the principal figure in the relaunching of Platonism into the mainstream of late antique society. And Plotinus had imperial patronage and set up shop in Rome, where he was a tutor to the imperial family, as well as to other people as well who would pay to attend his academy, modeled as many academies were after Plato's original academy in Athens. So this is one of a number of periodic revivals of philosophy in Roman society. Now, prior to this, in particularly the 2nd century, the dominant philosophy in the Roman Empire during the main heyday of the Pax Romana is actually not Platonism, although people are aware of Plato and of Platonism, and also certainly of Aristotle as well. But the dominant philosophy is something that we could broadly call Stoicism. It's taught in schools as part of the Paideia, the educational system. And there are particular schools or academies associated with different threads of this. Basically, it's focused mostly on moral philosophy. It's based around the cultivation of ethics for the ruling class, teaching them rhetoric, how to give speeches, and how to present themselves as ethical people in public life. And they're sincere about this, but of course it can also be a cover for all kinds of nefarious activities, as well, as Friedrich Nietzsche is happy to point out in his later reflections on the ambiguities of ancient societies. But what is important about Stoicism that makes it a little bit different than the Platonism that preceded and followed it is that its physics is based on atomism, or at least a version of that. Epicurus, the Epicureans, founded by Epicurus, had also been atomists. And so actually a type of atomic theory is actually dominant in metaphysics in the middle period of the Roman Empire. And towards the later empire, things get politically more dicey, and basically for about a century, the northern border of the empire is being actively militarily contested by so-called barbarians. That just means you're outside of the empire. And these are groups often from Germany, various tribal confederations, sometimes very large groups of people who see it as advantageous to immigrate into the fertile, agriculturally developed territory of the Roman Empire. Living is easier there because the economy is more developed in this large-scale agrarian productive system. Ancient societies are always threatened by famine, and so the advantage of a system like the Pax Romana is that they have a relatively, in parentheses, stable, or I should say relatively more stable, agricultural productive system because of the political and economic arrangements that are facilitated by the political unity of the empire. So people support the empire not just because the troops are there and they're going to get crushed if they revolt, but people legitimately want to be part of the Roman sphere of civilization, because so-called, because there are definite economic advantages. So these tribal groups from the north, they are moving south to settle, and then because they're moving as large armed groups, sometimes large significant armies trying to move in to settle, this is contested by the Roman legions, so there's constant fighting. And over the last century of the Roman Empire, the northern border becomes increasingly permeable as the Roman legions are unable to contest territory successfully with these other groups. And so they get political concessions to settle in various areas like in Gaul, the Franks settle there, so then it winds up being called France, even though they're not the original group there. No group is ultimately the original group in any area. Everybody comes from apes in Africa, and so we all moved somewhere at some point. So being native is relative, although it is a politically relevant factor that I don't want to just dismiss or negate. So anyway, as things are getting more problematic, a kind of otherworldliness, a kind of cultural asceticism, a kind of resignation to the deteriorating conditions of political decline in the empire begin to set in as a kind of cultural mindset. This is written about both by Eric Auerbach in his book Mimesis, which is a study of different types of narrative representation in Western societies, but it goes back to antiquity. He talks about the somberness, the macabre quality of the later empire. People sensed that things were getting worse and they weren't going to get better, and so you're just kind of hanging on, but you can still preserve this through a kind of will to power. You can still achieve a kind of civilized self-mastery, this kind of ascetic poise that the what's left of the political class, it's still hanging on to this ancient paideia the empire is trying to maintain for itself. And so Neoplatonism, late Platonism, becomes very appealing to this class in the late empire, and they become the patrons of the last great surge of pagan philosophy, which is a significantly philosophically developed and expanded and revised revival of ancient Greek Platonism. And it involves significant innovation and new ways of working out certain philosophical problems. And so it's a legitimate, it's not just a kind of decadence, although I do also want to associate it with that culturally, because I think that's a valuable perspective. But more importantly, it is a significant philosophical movement in its own right, in a way that I think deserves respect from a more contemporary analytical approach to philosophy, that we can appreciate the way that these philosophers treated and handled particular problems or issues in philosophy, and that there may be things we can learn from that. And of all of these philosophers, of which we've been looking at three of them, right? Porphyry. We're going to look at Iamblichus next week because he's all about magic. Okay, so he's the really important one from the point of view of our tradition. But Iamblichus is primarily based, as is Porphyry, on this really primary, somewhat earlier philosopher by the name of Plotinus. And his dates are from 205 to 270 of the Common Era. And his major work is called the Enneads, which means ninefold. And it was compiled and edited by Porphyry, who was a student of Plotinus. And this refers to the division of the 6 tractates into 9 sub chapters. So it's like a series of collections of 9 discourses or topical sections. And these are then further grouped into 6 tractates. The great translator of Plotinus is Stephen McKenna, and I very highly recommend his translation, which is still definitive in English, of the Enneads. There is a Penguin Classics edition, which is highly recommended. I have the slightly older printing of this with the Encyclopedia Britannica Great Books series, which were published back in the 60s in this binding with this wonderful tissue sort of Bible paper edition. And it's one of the few complete translations of the Enneads that's available in English, because Stephen McKenna only translated the first 5 Enneads, and so this edition includes the remaining 6 the sixth collection, which is completed by another translator. Okay, so basically Plotinus is a dualist. So there's matter and there's mind or spirit, which is what Plato talks about as the forms. And these are completely ontologically distinct from each other. But they have become mixed together, but also separated. So there's this kind of there's this dialectical tension in Plotinus, where he's a realist in the sense that there's been an actual emanation of spirit so that it's become attached to or connected with matter to infuse or inform that matter with form, thus creating the world. At the same time, as a kind of both end, it is both the case that there's been this actual enmeshment, so that, for example, physical objects actually do exist. They're not just a dream that's occurring to some higher being or absolute consciousness. This is a kind of Platonic physics, but it's sustained by a metaphysical formal principle that is supernatural and otherworldly, that has no fundamental connection to this world at the same time. The metaphor that Plotinus uses is light that shines through like a block of ice or a transparent rock crystal, or like a chunk of glass, where the light fully illuminates and is fully infused within and makes the whole substance luminous as it's passing through it. But the light is also completely separate. Its being is also at the same time completely separate from the material object of the crystal. And that's his metaphor for how form and matter are, or how soul and substance are both combined, but also at the same time completely separate. So, of course, for him, the human soul is an ideal form, he calls it, of the body, and it animates the body and gives it its form. But the soul is essentially otherworldly by nature, and in its nature, it's eternally united with what Plotinus calls essential soul, or soul as such. Soul which is ultimately by itself alone. And this takes the form of the ultimate being, which is a kind of, he describes as the transcendent one with a capital O, that is the ultimate ground of being. But there has to be a mediation, because the ultimate one, because it's perfect, it can't act, it can't do anything, because that would imply perfection, because that would imply change over time, and then it can't be eternally one with itself. So therefore, it is not the creator of the universe. It just exists ultimately by itself in its own reality outside of time and space. So the one is related only to itself, has no knowledge of the cosmos, and is eternally devoid of internal change or activity. It is pure mentation. It thinks only of itself. And because it thinks only of itself, and because it is itself a perfect being, it thinks only of perfection eternally without change. And so therefore, this is the way that it's perfect. Thinker and thought are the same. And this is the goal. The one is the goal and source of all religious piety for Plotinus, because it's the perfectly eleutheric being. Eleutheric is the Greek word meaning to be liberated, meaning from the state of being a slave. So you've been emancipated. You're not somebody's servant. And that means that to say that the one is the ultimately eleutheric being is to say that it's entirely liberated from any limitations of involvement with materiality. And so for the soul to become like the one is the goal of Plotinus's mysticism, and it does this through withdrawal of identification of itself with the body and contemplation of its pure noetic essence. So it's a kind of contemplative meditation where you contemplate yourself as pure rational mind, unidentified with materiality. You attempt in a kind of ascetic withdrawal from your body to remain alone with the alone, is the famous phrase that Plotinus uses to describe this condition of mystical union. And so Plotinus is disparaging of other types of religious activities that you could be involved in. He has some not unapproving things to say about magic, and we'll get to that in a little bit. But this turns out to be important because as time goes on, paganism is competing more and more with Christianity, which is becoming dominant in the Roman Empire, and eventually takes over the imperial court. And then at a certain point, Christianity actually becomes the official religion of the Roman Empire. And eventually, significantly in the future from the period that's in question here, the practice of paganism becomes illegal. And all the temples are closed. And it becomes very difficult for the pagans of that time, who are all, for the most part, Neoplatonists in lineage with Plotinus's kind of late Roman version of philosophical paganism, one form or another. And they're finding it very difficult to justify maintaining their temple rights because Plotinus isn't interested in the sacrificial rituals, the divinatory oracles, and so forth that are the social glue that holds pagans together. It's the activities that they do in public civically that makes what they do a public religion. And without support from that, either philosophically, and then with these competing Christians coming along, and they have their own ecclesiastical churches that they have the Mass, which is its own ritual. And so they're able to be the public religion in a way that then supplants pagan temple worship. Now, what's important about Iamblichus, who we'll get to more next week, he's the person who comes up with a version of Platonism that justifies temple religious activities. And these are what he calls theurgy. And these rituals can also be thought of or something like what in our own tradition we think of as magical rituals. And the purpose of these rituals or ceremonies is to invoke the union of the soul with one. So it's the same function as Plotinus's more purely contemplative philosophy, but it retains this somatic, embodied, performative, dramaturgic, ritual component. And then that becomes the basis for what we now call and think of as ceremonial magic. We're one step away from that, but because Iamblichus is so much based on Plotinus and responding to him, and also because Plotinus has actually some interesting things to say about magic, which we'll get to in a moment, which turn out to be the basis for Renaissance magic, particularly in Marsilio Ficino's theory of magic, which we talked about at the beginning of the class, that we can't skip Plotinus. And also he's innately an extremely interesting figure, as we will be seeing. So if I wanted to say what the criterion for Plotinus is for his philosophy, his theology rather. Theology always has a criterion and a method, or at least all good theologies have a criterion and a method. So for Aleister Crowley, the method of Thelema is magic, and the criterion is the law of Thelema, do what thou wilt, should be the whole of the law, with its corollary, love is the law, love under will, and then the associated development of that in the holy books and their commentaries and so forth. So the criterion gives you the the thing that you're aiming at or the particular perspective that you have when you're applying the methodology. So in the case of Plotinus, he obviously has Platonism. Platonic philosophy is his methodology. His criterion, I would argue, is, quote, this is a quotation from him, be sure that your theory of God does not lessen him. When therefore you seek to state or to conceive him, put all else aside, abstracting all, keep solely to him, see that you add nothing. Be sure that your theory of God does not lessen him. That's why God has to be in another world, because this world is imperfect and incomplete. And Plato was the philosopher who, in a way, most obviously recognized that, although it's also, Heraclitus is perhaps the pre-Socratic progenitor of this particular theme. But there's this other pre-Socratic philosopher by the, just a moment. So there's Heraclitus, and he thinks that you can never step in the same river twice. And Plato then comes along, and see, the point I'm making is that philosophy begins with the rejection of naive realism, of the common sense view that what you see is what you get, and you can just show up and know what's happening because you're the right person to do so. And this is typically linked with patriarchy. It's the male property owning, politically enfranchised, authoritative subject who comes along and they name things and say what they are and what they mean because they're the person who's good. They're the skillfully good person who has virtue, and therefore they know what the true is. It's like in Stoicism. What's valuable about Socratic skepticism and the skeptical tradition generally, and also this starting point for Platonism, is the recognition of the incompleteness of our knowledge and the willingness on the part of philosophy to engage with rather than ignore or avoid that. In modernity, this thing called foundationalism comes along. It restarts with Descartes, where again, people are trying to prove absolute truth. I think there's something valuable about Platonism's recognition that reality is incomplete, even if we're prepared to abandon the idea that there's another more perfect reality that's in some other supernatural world. That we shouldn't then make this world then complete and perfect. So let me put this another way in terms of the argument for pantheism, for example. It could be argued that in both Aristotle and the Stoic physics that's based on Aristotle, that philosophically they're a kind of pantheism because the universe itself has a soul. The cosmos as a whole has a soul. And that would be the highest, most perfect, biggest soul. And so that soul is called Theos. It's called God in these philosophies. Just as the planets are ensouled divinities, just as the stars are ensouled divinities, the universe as a whole is an ensouled pagan divinity, and the highest such divinity in these two philosophies. Plotinus is unsatisfied with that. He wants to, as we'll see in a moment, the universe is still a God that has a soul for him, which he calls nature. But he needs there to be a divinity higher than nature, because nature is imperfect. And if you make nature simply and directly identified with the highest good or the highest God, then you're saying that the highest good or the highest God is imperfect. And Plotinus doesn't like that. So he has to posit this extra transcosmic level. So I think there's something valuable, not so much in the positing of the one in another universe, but this recognition that the cosmos, the all, the universe, is an incomplete totality, is outstanding and open to a kind of future of itself that, like William James talks about, how rather than calling reality the universe, we should instead call it the pluriverse. That it's this diverse assemblage in this kind of conversation with itself. And that gets us to Crowley's stellar body of Nuit, within which every point is unique. And they're all in unique relations to each other all the time. And then that's a kind of temporality, a kind of history that we can project ourselves under will within, but in a sense, intracosmically, that through the path of recognizing that the cosmos is incomplete, we can divinize it, but leave that divinity itself in a kind of openness. We don't have to be obsessed with this idea that divinity has to be self-totalized. It is a process of moving towards a kind of totalization of itself. But the divinity is that very process itself, rather than necessarily this end goal that it's going to get at, is the point that I'm making. And that's the difficulty also with more modern philosophers like Spinoza, somebody I have a very high regard for, and Crowley did as well. Crowley calls Spinoza the God-intoxicated one, copying a phrase. Novalis, the German philosopher, romantic philosopher, had also called Spinoza this. And this is the beginning of Diary of a Drug Fiend, if you want to look up that reference, first few pages. Anyway, so for Spinoza, he's directly identifying the universe. He's directly identifies nature with God. But then for Spinoza, then because he's made nature God, well, then nature must be a complete totality. So therefore, he thinks it has to be deterministic, an obsession of the early materialist physicists, modernity, because they're transferring the attributes of the absolute, metaphysical absolute, which are totality and perfection and completeness. And they're saying, okay, well, if we're deists or atheists and we're taking God out of the picture, nature is everything, is reality, is everything, that's the all, that's the absolute, then it must have this kind of completeness to it. And that becomes a kind of, you can get very far with physics with that, you can get Newton with that. But then there's certain problems in Newton that you can't get beyond until you're willing to get to the new physics in the early 20th century with relativity and quantum mechanics, where in particular quantum mechanics is based on indeterminacy, which implies a kind of incompleteness, because there's necessarily, you see, an incompleteness to the information that reality can have about itself. Why? Because of Heisenberg's uncertainty principle. Because when you get down to the level of fundamental particles, the relations between those particles can be described in terms of a certain information that the interactions that they have to know about to be able to then have anything happen. But you can't know things about certain particles until an interaction occurs, what Heisenberg calls observation, although he doesn't define what observation is. So that means that there's a certain amount of information that hasn't been determined yet until an interaction occurs. It can only be defined probabilistically. Okay, well, then we have a kind of probabilistic universe. This is where the philosophy of Jacques Lacan becomes important, because as an alternative reading of structuralism that goes in a different direction than Jacques Derrida's deconstruction, which I think ultimately is kind of it's a dead end deconstruction. Lacan has this concept of what he calls the real with a capital R, and that defines the incompleteness of any semiotic descriptive system, but he also ontologizes this and treats any possible reality that could exist for itself or for us or in any kind of informational way, which is the way that anything that has any kind of causality in time that's occurring would need to have this informational component, as described in thermodynamic mathematics, for example, has this informational aspect. What that means is that reality itself has a kind of ideal virtual quality to it. So the ultimate materialism is itself a kind of dialectical union with idealism. But that means that when you take materialism by itself and try to just make it a direct, non-dialectical opposition to the type of transcendental metaphysics that's going on in Platonism, you say, okay, in early modern philosophy, we're going to set aside Platonism, get away from this. So let's be materialists, like Thomas Hobbes or whatever, like the nastiest of all materialists. Thomas Hobbes' Leviathan has the wonderful quality that everybody who ever reads it hates it. They don't like it. Nobody likes Hobbes. This goes all the way back to when he first published the book. It's the book that nobody ever has liked, ever, who's read it. Okay, anyway. So you have this hard deterministic physicalism. But it doesn't hold up to the physics as you probe in deeper and deeper. So you have to include this element of uncertainty or incompleteness. I think getting more comfortable with that, and I think Thelema in particular with its notion of the Kabbalistic zero as its ultimate principle, not Plotinus's metaphysical one or unity, but the Kabbalistic zero or nothingness, that allows us to conceive of a reality in a kind of temporal freedom or openness that we can then make of as we will and will to power through finding the true will. And so that moves us beyond Platonism, but we needed the insight to do that. We needed the insight that Platonism first had, which is to get past naive realism and realize that there's something incomplete about sense experience, so that we need philosophy to be able to figure out what's going on. And we can't just function in a kind of naive common sense. And so that is the wisdom of Platonism, and it's why it's still important to kind of go through the process of working through this historical argument so you can see the different stages, because then you can see how the pitfalls appear at different points where you can get stuck or trapped in some cul-de-sac where you can't make further philosophical progress. And your understanding in a Kabbalistic or whatever sense gets impeded. And so maybe there's this other path. So, for example, one way to talk about Plotinus's philosophy and maybe the actual tension is that his grammar is deficient, his philosophical grammar. He can't think nothingness as a zero, because remember, Greek and Roman mathematics doesn't have a concept of zero. They can think subtraction, but they can only think subtraction in whole units. So if you subtract from one, you don't get zero, you get not one or not two. You see, there's these. It's just another unit. So their number line doesn't include zero. So remember, there's no zero sign in Roman numerals because they don't have a category of zero. The category of zero was invented by Islamic mathematics. Is one of their great contributions to world thought. So there's a kind of tension in Plotinus's philosophy, which is that when he realizes that material reality is incomplete and he wants to abstract from that, he can only think that to a kind of primordial void. He can only a kind of interval, a kind of gap that would let him think that incompleteness positively or constructively. He can only think a unity. He can't think the concept of there being nothing other than reality. There has to be some super reality other than reality that would then account for the incompleteness of reality. Reality itself can't just be incomplete, because that would imply a kind of fundamental nothingness that he doesn't have the grammar. He doesn't have the language to think. And so this is why we can, because we do have a concept of not just nothingness or zero, but we also have a better probabilistic physics in the form of quantum mechanics that allows us to think form in a way that can understand the incompleteness of matter in a more constructive way. I did also want to mention, I alluded to this earlier, but I didn't complete this thought. There needs to be a mediation between the one and the cosmos, because they can't directly interact, because remember, the one is not the creator of the universe. Okay, so how does the universe get created, and how do souls get infused into matter? Where there's this other principle called what he calls the intellectual principle, and which fulfills the function of the demiurge. Now remember, and that's the creator of the universe. But this is Plato's demiurge in the Timaeus, not the negative evil demiurge in certain types of Gnosticism, but the benign higher soul that there's this metaphor in the Timaeus where the demiurge rides in a chariot and it has this bag of seeds that are the souls, and he sows them into the field of the world, and that causes it to grow and become. And because the demiurge is one step below the one, it can partake of enough imperfection to create and have further emanation of the soul forms into reality. Prime matter in itself is inchoate. It has no form or attributes except as it takes on soul to give it form. So it's a kind of nothing in itself. Although again, Plotinus isn't able to, has to think that through a series of metaphors rather than posit it in a more direct form, because he doesn't have the grammar of the zero. What else did I want to say about that? In the intellectual principle, the demiurge, Plotinus describes it as a concentrated all that's the unity of all souls. So souls all have their unity in this principle. Okay, how does the demiurge or the intellectual principle then emanate from the one if the one doesn't create or act? It still has to create the demiurge, right? Well, Plotinus has an interesting metaphor to get around that. What he says is it's like a fountain where there's water at the top and it spills over into the cups below. He says that's how the demiurge gets created, that the one is so filled with pure being that it without acting, it spontaneously overflows out of itself. And this overflow becomes the intellectual principle that then further overflows with its soul principles that are embedded into itself, into the emanation of the multiplicity of souls, which then inhere in matter and then create the universe. Like the overflow of a fountain. Okay, so this is an ontological dualism that is also grounded in an ethical dualism. Form and spirit is good, matter is evil. This is it's a basic dichotomy that's present in all versions of Platonism, and you can't get around it. Ioan Culianu, Mircea Eliade's famous student, wrote a great book on Gnosticism called The Tree of Knowledge. One of the great experts on this period of history, he's very insistent that it's a mistake to try to get rid of this hard edge of dualism in Platonism, that this really is kind of not just inherent to the system, but the thing that the philosophers who are arguing with this methodology, it's what they explicitly insist on being read in this way. And Plotinus, and when we get to Amicus, we'll see this too, Plotinus is no different. So you've got to, for him, separate yourself. It's an ascetic philosophy. You've got to separate yourself from materiality to reascend upwards. For For Plotinus, these stages are objective. So, for example, in Indian Advaita Vedanta, non-dualism, there is only the unity of being, pure consciousness. Everything that appears to occur in phenomenality is just a dream that the one reality is having. So there's no separation, there's no separate souls. All souls are the same soul. In Plotinus, he's more realist. So these different stages actually exist objectively. So the demiurge isn't, for example, just posited by human beings through a kind of, at least for Plotinus, he's positing as an actual state. Now, he would then argue that the Gnostics had gotten their interpretation wrong of what the demiurge is. And Plotinus argues in the Enneads that the Gnostics, so-called, and he does call them that by that word, and he means a group of schools, not just one group, but he's thinking of groups like the Manichaeans, and that they consider the universe to be evil and only the transcendent pleroma to be good. Now, Plotinus doesn't want to go that far. Materiality as such is bad and evil, but only as such. Insofar as it's been informed by form, it's been made good. So the cosmos is good, and the stellar, planetary, and universal divinities of the cosmos are good, but they're not as good as the one. And so there's a kind of great chain of being. There's a kind of hierarchy of descending goodness and descending badness and ascending goodness. And this hierarchy will become more prominent in Neoplatonism as it proceeds. It's implicit in Plotinus, though. And that breaks up into stages. So you don't just have this hard, just complete dichotomous dualism that you have, at least in some other versions of Gnosticism. And for Plotinus, the evil demiurge is a fiction created by people who don't have the right philosophy, which of course is his philosophy. Okay, let me take a look here. Another way to say this is that body or embodiment is the cause of evil. And the cause or the basis for good is the form. So you could also view that causally rather than substantially, although in Platonism it should also be thought always as being substantial. Okay, I want to look now at this passage on magic. Let me share my screen. Oops. Hang on a moment. Pull this up. Always doesn't. There we go. Okay, here we go. So this is a passage from the Enneads. Joseph, could you read us starting at number 40 here?
But magic spells, how can their efficacy be explained? By the reigning sympathy and by the fact in nature that there is an agreement of like forces and an opposition of unlike, and by the diversity of those multitudinous powers which converge in one living universe. There is much drawing and spellbinding dependent on no interfering machination. The true magic is internal to the all, its attractions and not less its repulsions. Here is the primal mage and sorcerer discovered by men who thenceforth turn those same ensorcellations and magic arts upon one another.
Okay, thank you. So it's clear that Marsilio Ficino read this passage and that it's the basis for his own theory of magic. Remember that there was this debate in Renaissance magic as to what the basis for magical effects was. Were you summoning potentially evil spirits to do your bidding who then carried out these actions? That would be bad. And so, because if you're working with evil spirits to do stuff, that would taint you with their evil, at least according to this scheme, this Christian interpretation of magic. Ficino, who wants to have natural magic as part of his philosophy and wants to revive the practice of it, he gets the idea from reading Plotinus. Well, the medium, the great magical agent that facilitates magical effects, it's the world soul, anima mundi, the fact that the cosmos has itself a form, just like our soul form. And just like our soul form is spread throughout our body, so that when I touch things with my hand, I can feel them because my soul form is spread throughout my body. And so any part of it that I use or connect is connected to all the other parts in virtue of my form, my spiritual form. In the same way, everything in the universe is within the world soul. It is a part of that. And so everything in the universe is also causally potentially in communication, and also causally connected with through sympathy, and other types of magical spell effects with every other part of the universe. And so magical causation can therefore be affected. And because the world soul is good, according to Plotinus, therefore this type of magic is inherently good. And this would also be the way that medicine would work. For example, when you take a pill or some kind of medicine, it has a positive effect on your body through this kind of sympathetic magic. Remember, they don't have the atomic theory comes back later in modernity, but they're still, scholastic physics is based on Aristotelianism, which is not an atomic theory. So they don't have a theory of how chemical molecules would interact to have medicinal effects. So this is their theory of how that works. It's a kind of magic. So medicine is magic. Alchemy is medicine, and medicine is alchemy. And it's all under this umbrella of natural magic. Remember that Ficino is both a Catholic priest as well as a medical doctor. So all of these things go together. And then Plotinus says, here's the primal mage and sorcerer. He means that the universe itself, the cosmos itself, is the great magician of what he calls the one living universe. Okay, let's move ahead here. Wait a minute. So in the other column, you see where my cursor is, where it says 41. Taryn, could you read us that first paragraph of section 41 there? When Plotinus says prayer, he means spell. This is a ritual spell. Go ahead.
The prayer is answered by the more fact that part and other part are wrought to one tone, like a musical string, which plucked at one end vibrates at the other also. Often, too, the sounding of one string awakens what might pass for a perception in another, the result of their being in harmony and tuned to one musical scale. Now, if the vibration in a lyre affects another by virtue of the sympathy existing between them, then certainly in the all, even though it is constituted in contraries, there must be one melodic system, for it contains its unisons as well as its entire content. Even to those contraries is a kinship.
Okay, so this is a concept of nature with a capital N, as it were. Nature as a causally closed and self-referential system. Basically not fundamentally different from the notion of physics that we continue to have today. And this notion of being constituted in contraries, there we're back to, and that these contraries nevertheless permit harmony. This goes back to the Heraclitean dialectic. This idea that nature contains contraries, but those contraries are then the basis for a kind of second level harmonization. And so the magician is the one who is in tune in their living with these harmonies in the world. And they're able to use their magical practice to use these harmonies and also be attuned themselves in harmony with these harmonies to achieve a kind of self-equilibration. And what's interesting about this is that it implies a kind of view of magic that has some compatibility with Thelema. Let me go to the next page here. And you see where my cursor is, where it says, for everything that looks to another. This is slightly blocked by the sidebar of my screen. Can the rest of you see this?
Yes.
Okay, great. Joseph, if you could go ahead and read just those first few sentences there. For everything that looks to another.
For everything that looks to another is under spell to that. What we look to draws us magically. Only the self-intent go free of magic. Hence, every action has magic as its source, and the entire life of the practical man is a bewitchment. We move to the only which has wrought a fascination upon us.
Okay, thank you. So the world's a magic spell that we're all caught up in. This is like in Liber Vel Magi, where it says that reality is this great magical spell that's been cast by the magus, and how are we to dispel it so that the true being of the Kabbalistic zero can become understood again, that we're not just caught up in the whirl of practical bewitchments and ensoulments. And I think particularly for us who live in a culture that's hyper-saturated by consumer media, that this hypnotic constitutive element of the horizon of being is all the more obvious to us. That even in the way that for more slightly earlier figures in modernity, like say Martin Heidegger or Karl Marx, it was already becoming apparent that mass media had this kind of hypnotic effect on human beings, that it was fundamentally alienating us in this way that was the same as had occurred before, but was also in this new amplified way. That this is even more, I think, apparent to us. So he says that the self-intent, those who have self-intention, are able to escape from this. Taryn, could you read us here at the beginning of 44 about contemplation?
Contemplation alone stands untouched by magic. No man self-gathered falls to a spell, for he is one, and that unity is all he perceives, so that his reason is not beguiled, but holds the due course, fashioning its own career and accomplishing its task.
Okay, how is this not a description of the true will? How is this not basically the Thelemic ideal, that we're in a world that pulls us within these certain expectations that we inherit from our class, our gender, our circumstances, and then we've got to make of that in a way to disenchant ourselves and then recoalesce to find a more deeper, meaningful purpose that's more our own specific, unique expression. We're not just pushed into this corner and said, do this task or whatever, and that's all you can do or think about who you are. But we can um, take advantage of the whole of what's available to us in human history and technology, and more deeply manifest the creative potential of our human freedom to make ourselves as a work of art, as Nietzsche would say. And that this is the dynamic of the philosophy of will to power read as a philosophy for artists, basically, which is Harold Bloom's reading of Nietzsche that I also subscribe to. And so back here in this ancient text, we've got this idea that there's this thing called magic, and it works this way, and here's how it works, and here's how you deal with it, so then you can use it rather than be used by it, and then you can live the good life that way. And this passage that we've just read is both the basis for Renaissance magic and the revival of kind of pagan humanism in modernity, and it's also the deep core strata of what's going on in the Thelemic tradition as well. And so that's why it's so useful and valuable to come back to these texts that are way back in the past and see, hey, there's this common thread here of human aspiration, that we're linked to this Gnostic chain, this the great spiritual brotherhood of whether you call that the AA or whatever you want, but this is the concrete expression of that historical genealogy of human spiritual wisdom that goes all the way back in the past, and that we're linked to, and that we're trying to promulgate into the future in our own lives and in our community. Okay, so we're coming up on 3 o'clock. I want to give us a full half hour for discussion. There's a lot to talk about here. This is a huge text that, unlike a lot of texts in antiquity, this exists in a full, complete form, and so it's one of our best surviving philosophical texts from antiquity. It's very philosophically rich. There's no way we can look at it in any kind of complete way, but I hope that I've hit the main indications of what this is and what it's doing and how its kind of basic rhetoric works, what's its basic philosophical perspective, so we can see how that feeds very directly into the chain of the historical dialogue that we're part of. So I now want to open to questions or comments, see if we can have a conversation about this for the next bit of the class. Anyone have any questions or comments about Plotinus?
I think. Oh, go ahead, Joseph.
Joseph, go ahead.
So it seems like Plotinus, even though he influenced magic, he's more of like the mystic side because he's more advocates contemplation.
Yes, and of course, mysticism is part of the Thelemic magical system. So magic with a K is both ceremonial magic and also mysticism as a kind of synthetic category. So Plotinus is really the basis for what the later medieval traditions call mysticism, whether that's Islamic Sufism, Jewish Kabbalah, any kind of contemplative aspect of that, but particularly there's this strong Christian Platonic tradition of what's called mysticism. Sometimes it expresses itself in philosophy. Usually it's more monastic and contemplative. The dominant philosophical form of Christianity in the Middle Ages is scholasticism, which is mostly, not exclusively, but mostly Aristotelian. But there's this very strong Platonic thread that also runs through this history, but it's mostly expressed as a kind of mystical spirituality. And Augustine is the primary progenitor of that in late antiquity, but his concept of mysticism and contemplation is very directly coming out of Plotinus. It's a kind of Christianized Plotinian Platonism. And so Plotinus is important not just because he's the endpoint or full kind of completed form of ancient paganism and what ancient pagan mysticism or contemplation is, but then that's the basis for what everybody after thinks that it is as well. And so it's also then basic to our own tradition as well. Now, of course, in Thelema, there's also yoga, which has both a Vedantic but also Buddhist expression in Crowley's thought. So, for example, the Kabbalistic zero is, I think, primarily a Buddhist mediated concept and is also a way of critiquing the type of Platonism that we've been looking at today, meaning Crowley wants to, the ultimate horizon for being for Crowley is not the metaphysical unity of Plotinus, but is the Kabbalistic zero, and which is a different and somewhat more complex concept. Crowley compares it to an imaginary number, for example. He says the kind of infinity that's nothing that I want to talk about isn't just a literal succession of things that then is a kind of completed totality or unity, but is the idea that you can never reach that point. And so things are open, but that's not a real number. That it's not an integer, that kind of infinity. It's an imaginary or unreal number, like pi. And the Greeks understood pi and fractions, but they didn't have that concept of imaginary numbers, which is again a more later modern concept of mathematics. So Plotinus is a simpler, more naive physics and metaphysics because the math and the physics that he has to work with are much simpler. We have the advantage of these being more, the models that we have to work with are more sophisticated, and therefore they do more work descriptively, and therefore we can get a little further philosophically. But a figure like Plotinus is definitely part of the conversation, and it's hard for us to know what our current categories mean without reference to him. So, for example, in Crowley, when he talks about a Kabbalistic zero, that only makes sense if you understand that he means that in distinction from a concept of a metaphysical unity that comes from Plotinus in the Platonic tradition. It comes from Neoplatonic theurgy, which he's attempting to adapt to modernity. But he's critically adapting it. How is he critically adapting it? Well, he has this Buddhist mediation, this concept of shunyata or nothingness. And so he's able to think infinity as a kind of open, unreal number, as opposed to Plotinus, who has to think infinity as an integer. It has to be an absolute one, the first integer. So he has to think it that way because he doesn't have a concept of number that isn't an integer, you see. But Crowley does. So therefore, he's able to kind of push the conversation further. Okay, is there another question? Taryn, you had something you wanted to say.
First, I want to just draw attention to the chat here of what Robert had pointed out. He's saying, if I heard you correctly, to Plotinus, the negative qualities sort of thrown upon the demiurge are essentially projections of humanity.
Okay, sure. Yeah, if that is the false so-called Gnostic reading that Plotinus has, I mean, clearly he thinks that philosophies that come to different positions than his are false or wrong, and so he criticizes it. So he has a whole section against the Gnostics in his book. Hippolytus isn't the only one who's against the Gnostics. Plotinus is also against the Gnostics. He means roughly the same thing as Hippolytus does, although Hippolytus, of course, is a Christian polemicist, whereas Plotinus is a Neoplatonic polemicist against. These are the types of dualism where the universe as such is considered to be evil. And Plotinus thinks that as a cause, matter is the cause of evil, and that as a cause, form is the cause of good, divine form. So the materiality of the cosmos is the part of the cosmos that's conducive to the evil that's in the cosmos. But the cosmos as such isn't evil because it's infused with form, and the form is good, and the form of the cosmos is therefore, which also ensouls the cosmos and makes it a god. This also is the cause for all the good that's in the universe. And so the universe also has good in it as well, because form is present and form is the cause of good. You see what I mean? So you can't just say that the universe is evil, which is attributed to Gnosticism, perhaps a little unfairly at times. Maybe in some contexts, this is a fair criticism. You know, we need to look at particular so-called versions of Gnosticism and see how they actually talk about this issue. There's harder and softer versions of that. So, for example, the Corpus Hermeticum, some of the texts in that are more disparaging of the cosmos as evil, whereas others are more like Neoplatonism and see the cosmos as basically good, but having evil in it because of things that went wrong, or etc. There's narratives in the text as to why that's the case, that don't add up to the whole show is ruined narrative of at least some versions of so-called Gnosticism. I'm hoping that's addressing Robert's question. The status of the demiurge is disputed in ancient wisdom traditions. This character doesn't have the same role or function in different. It's a common theme to posit this particular figure, but who they are, what they do, is very different depending on which tradition you're part of. It's this space where these different traditions fight out their differences. The source of evil is never the human soul. And since the real man or person, quote unquote man, the real person is the soul, human beings are essentially good for Plotinus, and indeed for Platonism as a whole. And indeed, Socrates even had kind of a weird doctrine, which he thought that if you knew what the good was, you couldn't not do it. So badness was always due to ignorance in human beings. It was never ultimately or directly motivated. And I think you could only have a philosophical position like that. Yes, evil is ultimately, well, it's not so much that evil is an illusion, it's that evil is caused by materiality. Materiality, which is not what is essentially what makes us human beings. Our soul is what essentially makes us human beings for Platonism. We only accidentally or contingently have a body. It's unnecessary for the soul to have a body. It only happens to have one. Our better, purer state is to be disembodied, is to ascend up into the heaven. And so evil isn't an illusion. In fact, it's what is most materially real about materiality. It's the kind of, it's the real that tugs against the ideal. So the human person is trying to escape to the ideal, and the real is pulling them back, and that's bad. That's the evil. So you could say that, I don't know if rhetorically this makes complete sense, but you could say that far from in at least this version of Platonism, evil is not an illusion. It's in fact that which is most not an illusion, least ideal or virtual, and that you're trying to nevertheless escape from that. And so it's different from certain forms of Advaita Vedanta, where or say Shankaracharya or the other sages of that tradition. What defines evil is that it doesn't exist at all. It's a complete. It's that which is most illusory. It's that which is least real. And that which is most real is the good, which is pure consciousness, which is pure divinity. But Plotinus is similar to that, but he divides it up a little differently. He doesn't have the same, because he's more of a realist, because he's a dualist. There's actually existing separate ontological categories of form and matter that are actual and are in that actuality actually distinct from each other. One isn't just an illusory projection of the other. And that goes the other way too. So you could have a kind of idealism where materiality is an illusion. You could also have a kind of reductive materialism where any kind of ideality is an illusion. And that, I think, also needs to be Plotinus is more similar to Samkhya than Vedanta. In Samkhya, you have a kind of realism of the Purusha and Prakriti both are real existing categories, and so there's a kind of dualism, and then they get mixed. And yes, Plotinus is and ancient Platonism is very much like Samkhya. Within the Indian darshana, the different philosophies, the different views you could have, Samkhya is the one that's probably most closest to Platonism. Vedanta is a little different. It's more idealist. It's more like Bishop Berkeley, who thought that in his idealism, to be is to be perceived, and so there aren't actually existing physical objects. There's only the appearance of them that mind has, and there's only mind. So there's only materiality is only appearance for Berkeley and also for Vedanta. Whereas for Samkhya, as well as for Neoplatonism, there's a realism where there's a dualism where these are both equally real principles. Any other questions, comments, thoughts, or reflections?
I wanted to ask, maybe I'm sort of drawing too much of a parallel here, but it really got me thinking about the introduction to Magic and Theory and Practice, where Crowley is outsetting all of those theorems, and that there's almost this sort of dynamic tension from point to point, because at times, like, he'll say that, you know, the magician has nothing to do but their will, and yet at the same time the magician doesn't know all of what they're capable of, and so therefore has to seek out what the will is. And I'm just wondering,
well, the
like,
true will, it gives this dynamic movement, but it can never be completely totalized. It always has to be in this kind of position of dialectical tension. I suppose in a way, when you die, you complete yourself.
Sure.
And that there's but then you don't have then a moment you don't then continue to have a personal time, and so it's not at the same time, it's a kind of end when you reach that totality.
Right. So how much do you think, though, that like this sort of Platonic Platonism is influencing his expression of those theories?
I think German idealism is more the direct influence on those kinds of reflections, because it's most similar to the idea in Fichte, particularly, but you find this in Schelling and Hegel and all the other larger constellation of figures that are part of that movement, whether that's Holderlin or Novalis or even Heinrich Heine a little bit later, that in Goethe's Faust, Faust is contemplating, he looks at the beginning of the book of Genesis, and he reads, in the beginning was the word. And he says, no, in the beginning was the act. And it's this idea that human beings are always completing themselves through practical action, which includes the contemplative element. So it's this kind of will-based philosophy, but at the same time, Fichte has this German word tribe, which means striving. And so for him, the absolute I is something that's ideally posited by the phenomenal I, but always in tension. It's always a kind of transcendence that you're moving towards. And so the real life, the real point where the will has, as it were, its fulfillment is in that dynamic tension, that striving from non-totality towards totalization. But then when you reach totalization, that's a negation that then moves you on to needing to posit some new totality. And so Hegel's the one who makes this the most dynamic, because each moment of the dialectic is this striving towards a totality, which then involves a self-negation, which then posits a new moment in the dialectic. And so that's history, the history of the world spirit for Hegel. It's this continual forward movement towards more and more complex development. And of course, for Freud, then that becomes a kind of way to model the psyche in a dynamic rather than a static way. The problem with Aristotelian virtue ethics and other forms of Stoic psychology is they're very static. It's like you're just some abstract person having virtues. There's no complexity in the application. It's just you're supposed to be like the right good person, and then you do good. And it's not politically dynamic or complex enough in terms of the way it's. And so modern ethics does better by more contextualizing that, but then you have to talk about what's going on in your historical moment and what type of a person you are in that moment. But then these are all the conversations that the true will you have to have in that discernment, as one is projecting oneself forward in time. Where Crowley says, again in the opening of Magic in Theory and Practice, that magic is a verb rather than a noun. And so, although the start of that is all in this kind of Stoic Platonic virtue ethics, it gets dynamized, and Romanticism is the moment where that more directly, philosophically, explicitly happens. And then Crowley's looking at that, and that's what's giving this dynamic aspect, which doesn't so much directly come out of Neoplatonism, but it's in the genealogy. You see, it's the conversation partner that's a few steps back.
Yeah, I almost sort of felt like that was kind of the thing where like he presents the one theorem that seems to be sort of this Platonist idea of the one, right? Like that the universe then becomes the total tool of the magician or whatever, but then he almost seems to answer himself by sort of stating the opposite. I don't know. I just got thinking about it when you were contrasting the one versus the Kabbalistic zero.
Yes, all of this is kind of dynamic for Crowley. So he says at one point, at a certain point, it's no longer the business of the master to have samadhi. What he means there is not that it's not the business of the master to have samadhi, but when you've had samadhi and everything's been unified in this kind of, you take the LSD and everything makes sense now, and you have this vision, Steve Jobs, I'm going to make personal computers and make a bunch of money. Everything makes sense now. I know my mission. But then the question is, okay, and now you're in the next moment, because you don't just stay in one state forever. You're part of a history that's your history. And then you're in this temporality where you're projecting yourself forward. What do you learn or gain from that samadhi that then you're able to make the next move? And then you can have the next samadhi that's more complete. And then the next one after that. And you don't have to just have some experience and you have the rest of your life looking back, worshiping that you had that experience. And then you don't do anything more. And also another point I want to make is that Crowley's pragmatic skepticism means that he doesn't have to ultimately come down on in favor of one particular philosophical position over another. He can dynamically use them all. He can grab whatever he needs at any point from any tradition to make that next move, to make that next point, or find that point of intellectual flexibility that's going to give him the next creative idea for what he's doing. And again, it's this kind of dynamic tension between positions where, like in in the Hegelian dialectic, it's not so much that one position is right over another, but that what you're looking at is trying to find the big picture where you can have the map of all possible positions within this world space. And then and only then do you understand what's going on. Does it then become obvious what that totality means? And then that implies the next thing that's happening. But you can only kind of know that retroactively. That's why in his philosophy of history, Hegel says the owl of Minerva flies at the dusk. Okay, what does he mean? He means that wisdom is kind of retroactive, that totalities only are completed in the past, never in the present. You're always looking back at them to extrapolate the future. But then that's this Fichtean tribe, this striving, that's then life, is this is the human spirit realizing itself in wisdom and understanding and gnosis. And in that sense, Hegel is a Gnostic. And Crowley is a kind of Gnostic in that kind of tradition. He's looking for this skeptical but also robustly synthetic position. What's the sort of most flexible, most biggest conversation that he can have, basically, with what's gone on in the past? And the thing that gets in the way of that is dogmatism. Is any kind of fundamentalist, oh, now I'm done because I have I've reached the totality and now it's completely unified and then nothing. The moment you reach that unity will then negate itself in that unification and you'll be on to the next moment. And maybe that's good. Maybe that's exactly what we want to be doing. So that's where I kind of fit Thelema into the larger conversation. Does that work? Is that a
Yeah, I think it's sort of it's the contrast of the two crises, but Crowley also says that really the crises are one and the same, right?
That's right.
It's just how you're approaching them.
That's right. You don't just have mysticism or magic, you have mysticism and magic, for example.
Yeah, beautiful.
You don't just have idealism and materialism, you have materialism and idealism. It's just you have to figure out how they're dialectically mediated with each other. Which of course then brings us back to the point that Robert was making in the chat a moment ago, which is there a position to mediate, for example, between Samkhya or dualism and a more absolute idealism of the Vedanta position? I think there is such a position, and it's called dialectical materialism. It's the type of realism where you identify that when we talk about matter or physicalism, that is itself a kind of ideal function. It has itself a kind of ideal quality. That's why I was talking earlier about quantum mechanics. What's so valuable about quantum mechanics is it shows us how when we're at our most materialist, we're also describing functions that have this ideal virtual character, so that we could talk meaningfully in a realist, materialist way about virtual particles, for example, which are a basic component of quantum mechanics, where, for example, to know the probabilities of a direction of how a particle is going to move, you have to have all the Feynman diagrams of all the possible particles that could appear or manifest at this particular point, which it turns out have a kind of reality to them because they're virtually there in a way that affects the probability of what's going to happen. It's as if they're there even though they're not. And this has a function, for example, in the way that, for example, black holes thermally radiate Hawking radiation, because virtual particles are always being created in the quantum fields of reality. And if there's a pair that gets created and one half of the pair is inside the event horizon, the other one isn't and escapes, that's a photon gets emitted and from the black hole. But then the black hole loses a photon of mass when that happens. And so it starts to evaporate, you see. So it's not a complete totality because it's subject to change. Now, it might take trillions of years for it to evaporate, but it's not a completely stable object, you see. It's also subject to, and in fact, from the point of view of the matter that's within that black hole, that evaporation might happen almost instantaneously because time stops within the black hole, maybe. We don't really know what happens in the black hole, but hypothetically, the event horizon effect means that time has stopped, But then that in that next moment, the black hole is going to evaporate because it's actually not in a stable position. And it's going to now impact and then bounce off the ultimate, when it hits that Planck limit where it can't reduce anymore, that kinetic energy is going to bounce back out. And so from the point of view of the black hole, just like with the supernova, the gravitational collapse bounces off of the core and you get this explosion. With the black hole, and the core remains as the neutron star. With the black hole, it collapses and then it bounces off and then evaporates. And from its point of view, that happens almost instantaneously. It's just because time slows down so much because of the event horizon that appears to take trillions of years from the point of view of the universe outside of the event horizon, as it appears to be this closed off area of space as it's finishing its collapse and then it goes poof. But the time is relative. And so the way the time passes over inside that space is so radically twisted and distorted and warped from what's happening outside of it. And so you get this kind of illusion that it collapses down to this completely stable state. And yet the lesson of the Kabbalistic zero is that there is no completely stable unity. Unification is always a self-negation that then opens itself to a further future. But then that means that there's always a future. So there you go. That's what you get from there being death, is that we get to be free. So it's like what we get for there being no God. It means that we're not slaves. It means that human beings are fundamentally ontologically free, and that's great, isn't it? Isn't that what we ultimately really want? So this is why I'm always confused when fundamentalist Christians come along and they're like, there needs to be absolute truth so I can enslave myself to it. It's like, why do you want this thing so you can have that? That doesn't seem to me to be a valuable end. I'd much rather live in William James's pluriverse, where there's all this ambiguity, but then there's this dialectical freedom. We've got just a few minutes more before the end of the class. Joseph or anybody else, do you have any more? Taryn too, any more questions or comments? Close this up.
I mean, I guess Crowley's advocating, kind of fluctuating between the 1 and the 0.
Yes, sir. There's a kind of
like the Fool card and the Magician card, going back and forth, and you need to return to the primordial chaos to reformulate what truth is, but then you go back to the world of action and create. So yeah.
Yeah, then that creation undergoes what the Sefer Yetzirah calls permutation. It gets more complicated, and so then there needs to be more unification or coordination, and so it just keeps moving forever as this dynamic movement, and then we find our place in that conversation through the true will, and then that's our piece of the puzzle that we get to communicate and contribute, and that could be meaningful to us and meaningful to others, and then that meaning continues into the future beyond our personal existence, and then we have a kind of immortality in that as well, where the meaningfulness of our existence extends indefinitely and infinitely beyond our personal private time that we have, which also for ourselves forms a kind of eternity in reference to ourselves, a kind of bounded but also open space as well. Anyway, we're coming up on 3:30 next week. We're going to do the last class, which is on the Iamblichus and theurgy, and we'll see how magic integrates all of this in ancient theurgy. Thanks everybody for joining us today, and I hope we'll continue to have an interesting conversation next week as well. So everybody have a good week. Love is the law, love under will.